back to the CompTIA A+22801 exam. Anthony here. We're going to talk about configuring the BIOS part 1. I hope I was talking a little bit slower in that last video, and I'm going to try to maintain that in this video. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to try to maintain that in this video. This is all a learning experience for me, so I appreciate everyone sticking through with it through me here. Anyway, let's talk about configuring the BIOS. This is part 1 of a two-part series where we're going to talk about this, so let's get into it. So, let's talk about BIOS. BIOS is stored on the motherboard on a ROM chip. ROM stands for read-only memory, and to get more into detail on that, the ROM chip is non-volatile, or pretty much any read-only memory is generally non-volatile, which means it does not lose its info when the computer is powered off. Once the ROM chip has been programmed, it can't be easily changed. That doesn't mean it's impossible to change it, it's just not easily changed. Motherboards of the modern variety now use a type of ROM called flash ROM. Flash ROM can be changed using special software, which is generally provided by the motherboard manufacturer. And when you're flashing a ROM chip, it's generally called installing firmware upgrades. So when you're dealing in the world of firmware, there's a few things to keep in mind here. So programs stored on read-only chips are called firmware, and programs stored on erasable media are called software. So you could think of it in that way. If a program is easily removed and disposed of, it's software. If a program is not easily changed and is persistent, it is firmware. And things of the nature that are physical are considered hardware. So you have your soft, firm, and then hard in that order. The BIOS contains information for two kinds of hardware settings. We have hardware and settings that can never change, and hardware and settings that can be changed. So if settings can be stored, how is it read-only? Well, there's a companion chip here called the CMOS chip that stores settings that you can actually change. So the CMOS chip stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. A little fancy. You probably want to know that for the test. But at the very least, you should just know that the CMOS is where information that is changeable in the BIOS system clock, voltage settings, things like that, anything that you can basically modify, that's going to be stored on your CMOS chip. The ROM chip reads some of the data from the CMOS chip, and then you can easily make changes to the CMOS chip by going into the BIOS and just, kind of messing with things that way. Then it will transfer that data over to CMOS. So the BIOS runs on the ROM chip. It will read the data from the CMOS chip and then send all of its instructions that it both has hardwired into itself as well as anything stored on the CMOS chip to the CPU. So you can configure the BIOS in many different ways. It just kind of varies depending upon the type of motherboard you have and the version of the motherboard, but there's generally a key combination in order to get into the configuration of the BIOS, and that's generally, it could be escape, it could be F1, it could be F2. It may take a few tries to find the right key. Generally, it will pop up on screen and say like F1 to enter setup. Setup is generally synonymous with BIOS, and you'll often see the term setup more frequently used than entering BIOS, as that's kind of a more user-friendly term. If you can't find the key on screen, you can always check the motherboard documentation for more info. We're going to continue getting into the ins and outs of actually configuring the BIOS next in part 2 of configuring BIOS. I hope you will stick through this with me.